Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now we will discuss translation and communication. This module is written by Abhishek Sharkar, an independent research scholar. Now, let us begin a discussion that what is the role of translation in communication and how translation has been used as a medium for communication, different kinds of communications. Down the edges, there has been much speculation about the task of the translator. Translation has popularly been seen as an act of carrying meaning from one language to another, and the meaning of the source language must be communicated in the target language and to the target audience. This is why the questions of fidelity has been so central to translation. If the translator has to communicate, he must carry the message embedded in a text across a series of laws and gain to the target language. And a message, by definition, is subject to authenticity. One must be faithful to the original to communicate the right message. So, transfer of meaning is intrinsically linked to the transfer of knowledge and hence information. The two cornerstones on which the edifice of communication stands are: one, successful dissemination of information, and two, a common meaning shared by both the sender and the receiver. And as Habermas would like to note, communication builds the foundation of social actions. When different kinds of equivalence theories propose variations of the direct or strictly faithful to the original and the indirect or loosely faithful or a general interpretation of the original translations, they basically invite our attention to ways and ethics of communication given different context. Texts are not only extremely complex structures but are also varied in nature and the purpose they serve, which would mean that the translation can be compared with the original with respect to a large number of factors. Equivalence theorists would put inordinately high emphasis on synonym, oblivious of the various other contextual factors such as metrical condition, cognitive respectivity, and so on. Even the ones like House, who could actually read translation of its lexical prism, overlook the relativity that defines the project of translation. Hughes suggests that the source textual profile should be the yardstick for the evaluation of the target text appropriateness. Textual profile is a combination of 8 features along which a text is linguistically classified. So Hughes's suggestion is to match the textual profile of the source text with the target text. But how to do that? It is hardly a straightforward task. How then do we account for the translational communication? The first theory we are going to discuss is Skopos theory and translation. Wimmer's idea of Skopos is a functional theory of translation as communication that is premised upon the notion that the act of translation is driven by purpose, and it is this purpose that shapes the kind of translation and the kind of interpretation it receives. As Reith and Wimmer note, the object of our theory is translational action and not the product like the translatum. So in this theory, the process of translation is basically a function of the product. The function is determined by the receiver. The theory marks an important shift in the domain of translation, that from the theories of equivalence, a wide variety of purposes or scopoi determine the kind of translational act one undertakes. This is to say that one task of translation may be taken up for a number of reasons, might meet several scopoi at the same time, along degree of emphasis or prioritization. These scopoi are supposed to be organized hierarchically. The task of the translator is to justify the prioritization of one scopos in a given situation. So translation here is less of a matching task and more of a task involving decision making. A text in Skopos theory is an offer of information, and the offer is made by the producer of the text to its recipient. Quite clearly, it is recommended that the TT or target text is coherent with the situation of the audience or the recipient of the target reader. This is to say that the translator would want to make target text a part of the target situation. So it also counters all notions of fidelity and proposes that coherence is the moot issues in translation. The translational intertextuality is heavily dependent on this principle. Keeping to the basic brief of communication theories, a text must also be intertextually coherent. So Skopos theory brings into play three kinds of coherence. One is coherence with the target situation, coherence with the source text, and coherence with the target text. The intertextual coherence, on which major emphasis is put in Skopos theory, depends on the translator's interpretation of the source text, the translation scopos. The translator's motivation are not always free. In fact, on most counts, it is mediated by a client or the one who commissions the work. So the translator has a brief, and this brief often plays a crucial role in determining the scopus of the translation. The hierarchy is organized accordingly. One of the facets of such intertextual coherence is fidelity to the source text, but that form of coherence may be overpowered by scopos. The hierarchy is crucial, so the translator is freed from limitations and restrictions imposed by a narrowly defined concept of loyalty. The end, as they say, justifies the means. The end, that is the target situation, is certainly embedded in a cultural matrix. Wimmer considers norms and conventions as foundational to culture. As Nord puts it, translating means comparing cultures. Translators interpret source cultural phenomena in the light of their own culture-specific knowledge of that culture from either the inside or the outside, depending on whether the translation is from or into the translator's native language and culture. Xiaowen Du goes on to explain, in the case of translation, the translator is a real receiver of the source text who then proceeds to inform another audience located in a situation under target culture. Conditions about the offer of information made by the source text. The translator offers this new audience a target text whose composition is guided by the translator's assumptions about their need, expectations, previous knowledge, and so on. These assumptions will be different from those made by the original author because source text addresses and target text addresses belong to different culture and language communities. This means the translator cannot offer the same amount and kind of information as the source text producer. What the translator does is to offer another kind of information in another form. Hence, instead of equivalence, adequacy appears as the most important quality of a translation. The idea of adequacy is contingent on the translation brief. A translation is adequate would simply mean that it adheres to the brief. Now, relevance and translation. Sperber and Wilson's relevance theory marked a major impact on communication studies. Relevance theory focuses on the processes, how the faculties of human mind make communication possible. So here we have a theory of communication that does not operate on the process of text production or even does not rely on the text as a product in its quest to explain the phenomena of communication. The external factors in Quinian terms, the evidences are not likely to influence translation unless they are internalized, made part of the minds of the translator and her audience. We need to underline that what we did just now was to recast translation as communication, but this does not sound unusual, as translation has long been seen as stated earlier as a vehicle of a message. Once treated as such, translation seems to be communication defined as a process of coded transaction, as has been suggested by many communication theorists. Verbal communication has traditionally been read as a process involving encoding, transfer, decoding of messages. Relevance theory looks at communication as a cause-effect relationship, and hence the message coded by the sender itself is a resultant of evidences, not a direct offspring of them, and again is not transmitted verbatim to the receiver through the target text, but works as one of the causes facilitating translation. Sperber and Wilson maintains that human beings' ability to draw interfaces is crucial to communication of any sort. So the communicator is supposed to produce a stimulus from which the audience should infer what the means or rewriting it following the relevance theory. It hints at the informative intention of the communicator. When a person who just asked you, "What is the time, please?" receives a reply, "Sorry, I don't have a wristwatch," she infers that one wants to say that one cannot tell her time. Translation is a process that is triggered by the semantic representations and the propositional forms. The mind has a language module within which certain experiences are coded as semantic schemes to be further processed into propositions. A word may have a default meaning, but in a given sentence or text, that meaning is not necessarily retained. Hence, the notions of semantic representation, the default meanings of linguistic expressions, and propositional forms through which the actual meaning of the expression is carried are invoked. But this inference takes place in a context, and to explain the relationship between translation and the relevance theory is to unearth how the hearer deciphers the actual meaning conveyed with recourse to the internalized context of the speaker. The mental life is transmitted but not fully. All the assumptions of the sender are not equally accessible to the receiver, and hence certain assumptions are modified by the receiver. This opens up the scope for interpretive intervention. On the other, human beings have an instinctive interest to improve their understanding of the world around. These modifications are known as contextual effects. The translator, according to Quinn, is basically a receiver of message who infers and recognizes the message in a target language with the help of evidences. Furthermore, Davidson asserts that the relation between the actual world of objects share a cause-effect relationship with the intentional meaning and semantic representation and propositional forms in relevance theoretic terms, quite clearly provides that cue and opens up further possibility of interpretation with contextual effects. These interpretations is the translator's home turf. Translation survives on the incessant hunger to know the other, which often takes the form of colonial discovery. The relevance theoretic framework following the communicative principles categories translation as interlingual interpretive use and direct translation, direct and faithful communication of the information enshrined in the source text. But the distinction between them is blurred when the contextual effects. Instead, it puts translation on a fine balance. The translator must strike a fine balance between the information passed and the contextual effects of the target language. Relevance theory makes is amply clear that the art of translation is contingent on this fine act. This questions the binary opposition between fidelity and naturalness, translation and information. As Frank Ostermuhl rightly points out, the context in which translation is conducted these days is a context that is characterized by the information age. By internationalization and by global networking, translation studies from its nascent stage considered the issue of loss and gain of meaning as a serious issue of prolonged debate. The debate was, as is apparent, on the lines of fidelity and later on the lines of the unity of expressions across languages. But in an era of information, technology and globalization of information, the task of a translator is hardly limited to conveying the information of the source text to the target readers, but also to make it legible for hearer. Hence, translation at this hour is as much about rendering the meaning of the source text into the target text as about localizing it to suit the target reader's world of cognition. But this marks a clear departure from traditional target text general propensity to deal with the literary text. Practical translation makes us look into the act of scope of translation more from a practical utilitarian perspective than a literary critical one. Loss or gain of meaning in literary text may not be equated with the loss or gain of information in practical translation. Although a serious theoretical research is still due, practical translation has made its presence felt in various ways. The semantic equivalence has given way to the informative equivalence. The task of the translator is no more the presentation of information accurately, but to carry it to the audience successfully. The target reader of this purpose-driven translation is faced with a global text that is transformed into a local one or vice versa. As in the globalized world, the international is defined in terms of privileged power of position, be it economic or otherwise. A translator in this case is more concerned about the colonization and the democratization of knowledge systems enshrined in different cultures than in the communication of linguistic meaning. With the steady growth of information technology, the virtual space is abundant with textual information, and the very project of globalization is heavily dependent on fact and different dissemination of information. Practical translation plays a key role in addressing the global in a localized manner. So, in this module, we have discussed theories to see, to observe, to evaluate the position of translation in communication, when translation is used as a method of communication, when translation is itself is a mode of communication, and how the text, the message of source text is communicated into target text. So we discussed Skopos theory, we discussed the relevance theory in this context, and we also discussed that what is the role of translation as communication in this era of overloaded information technology, when our spaces are full of information, knowledge and text available about a certain subject. So in this context, what will be the role of translator in terms of communicating the meaning? So all these issues are discussed here in this module, and this module will help the listeners to understand the previous role of translation in communication or as a mode of communication, and the present role of translation as mode of communication. Thank you.